It was May 10, 1940, the day Germany invaded France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Blitzkrieg had exploded across Europe like lightning. In a matter of days, the Nazi war machine crushed defenses that Britain had believed would hold for months. As panic spread through London, a man with a gravelly voice and a defiant stare walked into 10 Downing Street as the new Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill. He was 65 years old, a man many considered washed up. Just weeks earlier, his own party doubted him. Yet, as Neville Chamberlain resigned, the king reluctantly called Churchill to form a government. Britain was isolated, the French army collapsing, and the British Expeditionary Force trapped on the continent. Even before he sat behind his desk, Churchill knew this was not just a political job, this was a fight for civilization itself. As the Luftwaffe filled the skies and German panzers tore through Europe, Churchill's first act was to form a war cabinet. But within those walls, the air was thick with fear. Senior ministers whispered of negotiation, perhaps even surrender. To them, continuing the fight against Hitler seemed suicidal. But Churchill, in that first week, resolved that no peace with the devil could ever be trusted. Britain would fight, even if she stood alone. Inside the underground cabinet room, the tension was unbearable. The walls trembled as bombs began to fall over Europe. To Churchill's left sat Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, calm, aristocratic, and quietly persuasive. He believed Britain should seek mediation through Mussolini, who still posed as a neutral power. If Hitler would guarantee Britain's empire, Halifax argued, perhaps peace could be reached. Churchill listened in silence, puffing on his cigar. His mind raced. He knew what such peace meant: the end of freedom in Europe, the domination of Hitler, and eventually the enslavement of Britain herself. But Halifax was persuasive, and many around the table agreed. Britain's army was cornered at Dunkirk. The French government was on its knees. To resist seemed hopeless. In those claustrophobic meetings, history hung by a thread. Churchill often left the room exhausted, pacing his office, muttering aloud to himself. He later wrote, "I was sure we should not fail, but I could not be sure we should be believed." The pressure was crushing, not only to fight a war, but to convince his own government to stand firm. By the third week of May, Churchill's position was fragile. He faced the possibility of being overruled by his cabinet, replaced by a man who would sign away Britain's future. Yet, behind his fatigue and frustration, a spark of defiance remained unbroken. As the situation in France worsened, Churchill turned to his greatest weapon, his voice. He knew that if Britain was to resist, the people must believe. On May 19, 1940, he delivered a radio broadcast to the nation titled, "Be Ye Men of Valor." His tone was grim, but his words electrifying. "Arm yourselves, and be ye men of valor, and be in readiness for the conflict. For it is better for us to perish in battle than to look upon the outrage of our nation and our altar." His speech rippled through the British Isles. Ordinary citizens, dock workers, farmers, clerks, stopped what they were doing to listen. They knew their backs were against the wall. Yet, in Churchill's voice they heard not despair, but defiance. He did not promise victory. He promised struggle. As the bombs fell and the news from France grew darker, something remarkable happened. The spirit of resistance began to grow. Even as his ministers doubted, the British people began to believe in him. And that belief would soon be tested as never before, when the fate of 300,000 men at Dunkirk hung in the balance. By late May 1940, Britain stood on the edge of annihilation. In northern France, nearly 400,000 Allied troops were trapped between the English Channel and the relentless advance of Hitler's armies. The French front had collapsed. The port of Dunkirk, once a quiet fishing town, had become a desperate lifeboat for the British Expeditionary Force. Churchill's War Office reported that only a few thousand men might be rescued. The rest, they feared, would be captured or destroyed. Inside the war rooms, the air reeked of smoke and dread. Every night, Churchill stared at maps filled with red pins, each marking another lost position. "I will not abandon them," he growled. When the evacuation began on May 26th, Churchill called it Operation Dynamo. It was a gamble that depended on weather, luck, and courage. Destroyers and troopships raced across the Channel, braving German bombers and artillery. But it wasn't enough, so the call went out to every small vessel in Britain. Fishermen, ferry captains, pleasure boat owners, all joined the rescue. For 9 days under constant attack, a miracle unfolded. Nearly 338,000 men were brought home, not to victory but to fight another day. Churchill watched the numbers grow with disbelief, but he refused to call it a triumph. Wars are not won by evacuations, he told Parliament, yet privately he knew, if those men had been lost, Britain's fight would have ended before it began. Dunkirk was not victory. It was survival. After Dunkirk, many believed the war was effectively lost. France was collapsing. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, and Hitler's invasion fleet was assembling across the Channel. In the War Cabinet, Lord Halifax renewed his call for peace talks. He argued that continuing to fight would only bring destruction to Britain's cities and empire. On May 27th and 28th, the debate reached a breaking point. The meetings were brutal. Tempers flared, voices rose. Churchill's allies, like Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, urged him to stand firm. But Halifax was calm and persuasive. "If we can get honorable terms," he said, "why should we not hear them?" That night, Churchill was alone in his underground flat. He slumped into his chair, exhausted, the weight of civilization on his shoulders. Outside, London slept uneasily, its streets dark under the threat of air raids. He poured himself a whiskey, and for a rare moment the mask of courage slipped. He knew Britain's defenses were weak, its army barely armed, its skies vulnerable. He whispered to himself, "What if they are right?" But then he thought of the German boots that would march through London, the swastika flying over Westminster, and the silence that would follow the death of freedom. His despair hardened into steel. He wrote a few words on a scrap of paper. "We shall not fail or falter." By dawn, Churchill had made his decision. Whatever happened, Britain would fight alone. He would rally his people even if it meant defying his own government. On June 4th, 1940, Churchill rose to speak before the House of Commons. His notes were brief, just a few phrases scrawled in his thick handwriting. The room was silent as he began, his voice steady but fierce. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." For nearly 30 minutes, Churchill spoke without theatrics, without gestures, but with a conviction that filled every corner of the chamber. His words rolled like thunder, echoing far beyond Westminster. Members of Parliament sat transfixed. Some gripped the edges of their desks, others stared straight ahead, fighting tears. When he finally sat down, there was silence. Deep, heavy, emotional silence. And then an eruption of cheers that shook the walls. But the speech was not meant to celebrate. It was a warning. A promise that Britain would resist invasion no matter the odds. Churchill knew that Hitler would not stop. He also knew that Britain stood alone. France was falling, and America was still watching from across the Atlantic. Yet, through the sheer force of his words, Churchill had given the British people something far more powerful than weapons: belief. That evening, the BBC broadcast his words to the nation. Across Britain, in pubs, factories, and dimly lit living rooms, ordinary people listened in rapt silence. Dock workers wiped grease from their hands. Mothers, clutching children, leaned closer to the radio. Soldiers, still mud-stained from Dunkirk, sat on wooden bunks and whispered the lines to one another. One private, writing home that night, said, "We were beaten, tired, and empty. Then the Prime Minister spoke, and we felt like lions again." For Churchill, this was more than rhetoric. It was the beginning of Britain's defiance, the moment when language became a weapon sharper than any blade. The speech unified a nation on the edge of collapse. It was the birth of the British will to fight, the resolve that would carry them through the Blitz, through loss, through years of darkness. He had given them something to live and die for. The evacuation of Dunkirk had been a miracle, but Churchill knew that miracles alone would not win the war. As the battered British army regrouped on home soil, dark clouds gathered over Europe. France was collapsing. Hitler's forces were preparing for invasion. Britain now stood utterly alone, one small island against the Nazi war machine. On June 18, 1940, just 2 weeks after his "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, Churchill returned to the House of Commons to speak again. His words this time were not just a rallying cry, they were prophecy. He said, "The battle of France is over. The battle of Britain is about to begin. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. It was a moment of profound gravity. Every man and woman who heard those words understood the weight they carried. Britain had no one left to rely on. Its airfields were targets, its coastlines vulnerable, its people exhausted." But Churchill's voice, gravelly, unrelenting, and utterly certain, cut through the fear. Across Britain, people began digging trenches, blacking out their windows, and preparing for invasion. The Home Guard drilled with broomsticks and makeshift rifles. Children were evacuated from cities. The country braced itself, not in panic, but in grim determination. Churchill's genius lay not in pretending that victory was certain, but in convincing people that resistance was sacred. He made defiance itself a form of triumph. And as the Luftwaffe turned its eyes toward Britain, Churchill's words became the spirit of the nation, unyielding, brave, and utterly defiant. By July 1940, the roar of engines filled the skies above southern England. The Luftwaffe came in waves, bombers escorted by fighters sweeping in from across the Channel. Their mission: destroy the Royal Air Force and clear the path for invasion. It was the beginning of the Battle of Britain, and never before had the fate of a nation hung so heavily on so few shoulders. The RAF pilots, many barely out of their teens, scrambled daily, sometimes 5 or 6 times a day, to meet the enemy head-on. They flew Spitfires and Hurricanes, weaving through clouds and tracer fire in desperate dogfights that raged over fields, towns, and the English coast. Churchill watched the battle unfold from underground war rooms and from the roofs of London buildings. He visited airfields, shook hands with grease-streaked pilots, and looked into the faces of the young men who would decide the nation's fate. When one officer apologized that his pilots were nearly spent, Churchill replied quietly, "Then we must give them everything we have." The RAF held firm. Against overwhelming odds, the Luftwaffe began to falter. Radar, a British invention still shrouded in secrecy, gave early warnings of incoming attacks. The courage of the pilots, and the engineers, mechanics, and ground crews who worked through bombings to repair aircraft, began to turn the tide. For every bomber shot down, a sense of hope grew stronger. The world watched, and for the first time, Hitler's advance had met resistance that would not break. By August 1940, the Battle of Britain had become a daily test of endurance. The skies were on fire. Londoners watched the dogfights above them and cheered when enemy planes fell from the clouds. The British public began to recognize the faces of their defenders, the few, as they would come to be known. Churchill felt the weight of their sacrifice deeply. He visited hospitals where wounded pilots lay bandaged and pale, often asking them quietly, "How many did you get?" They would smile faintly, knowing that their Prime Minister, the man leading the entire war effort, had come to see them personally. Then, on August 20th, 1940, in one of his most unforgettable speeches, Churchill stood before Parliament and said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." It was not just a tribute, it was a revelation. The people of Britain suddenly understood that the battle raging above them was more than just defense. It was survival. Each dogfight was a line drawn between freedom and tyranny. In factories, workers built faster, In fields, farmers worked longer. Housewives sent letters to pilots they would never meet. Britain was united not by weapons, but by will, and by Churchill's unwavering belief that even in the darkest skies, courage could be the brightest light. The Blitz was about to begin, and Britain would face its greatest trial yet. But, thanks to Churchill and the few, the nation had found something Hitler could never bomb out of existence: hope. By September 1940, Hitler changed tactics. If the Royal Air Force could not be destroyed in the air, he would try to break the British spirit on the ground. On the evening of September 7th, the first great wave of bombers crossed the Channel and descended upon London. The sky turned red. Warehouse districts along the Thames erupted in flames. Explosions rolled through the East End as fire brigades raced from one inferno to the next. For 57 consecutive nights the bombs fell. Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, and countless smaller towns burned. The Blitz had begun. In Downing Street, Churchill stood on the rooftops during air raids, watching the bombs fall from the sky. Advisors begged him to take shelter, but he refused to hide. He wanted to face what his people faced. When he toured the smoking ruins of East London the next morning, ordinary citizens gathered around him, some still covered in dust and soot, others clutching photographs of loved ones lost. He took their hands, murmured words of comfort, and promised them Britain would endure. "We can take it," Londoners began to say, and Churchill's presence made them believe it. Night after night the bombs fell, and yet the city did not break. Underground stations became shelters. Families sang, children slept on makeshift bunks, and somewhere above, St. Paul's Cathedral still stood, wreathed in smoke, but unbowed. The Blitz was meant to crush morale, but instead it forged unity. It turned civilians into soldiers of endurance. And Churchill, standing amid the rubble, embodied their defiance. He was not merely a prime minister. He was the living spirit of a nation refusing to kneel. Radio became Churchill's greatest weapon. His speeches, broadcast to millions, carried hope through static-filled airwaves into bomb shelters and blackout-curtained homes. His deep, rolling voice became the heartbeat of Britain. He did not hide the horror of what was happening. He described it. He spoke of the ordeal of fire, but always, always he ended with a note of iron will. "We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." These words did more than comfort. They armed the spirit. In them, people heard not a politician, but a man who shared their fear and their fury, who refused to surrender even when surrender seemed logical. Meanwhile, Churchill's leadership style, volatile, emotional, and brutally honest, kept his war cabinet on edge. He could be irritable, demanding, and sleepless, yet his energy was infectious. He pushed ministers, generals, and scientists alike to think bigger, move faster, and never settle for good enough. He stayed up late into the night, dictating letters, issuing directives, and reading reports by candlelight in the cabinet war rooms. His staff struggled to keep pace, but no one dared slow him down. Britain's survival, everyone knew, was driven by this one man's unyielding willpower. When the bombs stopped falling at dawn, Churchill would emerge exhausted but resolute, and declare to his aides, "We will have no parley with the Nazis, no peace with slavery. We shall fight until the curse of Hitler is lifted from the world." It wasn't bravado. It was conviction. And that conviction kept Britain standing through the long, burning nights. By early 1941, Britain stood isolated. France had fallen. The Soviet Union and the United States remained on the sidelines. Supplies were scarce, cities lay in ruins, and the seas were hunted by German U-boats. The British people faced hunger, exhaustion, and grief, but not defeat. Churchill knew he had to do more than defend. He had to inspire endurance. He introduced rationing with fairness and compassion. He wrote personal notes to families who had lost loved ones. He walked among the rubble-strewn streets of London, tipping his hat to the women clearing debris, telling them, "You are doing the work of soldiers." The press adored him. Children collected his photographs. Cartoonists depicted him as a bulldog, short, pugnacious, defiant, the very image of British resistance. And though he sometimes raged in private, in public he radiated strength. In moments of quiet, Churchill admitted to close aides that he had never felt so alone. The burden of leadership weighed heavily. The nights were long and filled with worry, but he never allowed despair to take root. Instead, he reminded his people, and himself, that kites rise highest against the wind, not with it. It was this spirit, unbreakable, stubborn, and deeply human, that carried Britain through its darkest winter. When the United States finally entered the war later that year, Churchill knew that history had turned. But the reason Britain had survived long enough for help to arrive was simple. Its people refused to yield, because their leader refused to doubt. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Churchill was at Chequers, his country residence. As soon as he received the news, he turned to his aides and said quietly, "We have won the war." He knew it wasn't over, not yet, but America's entry changed everything. The industrial and military might of the United States now stood beside Britain. For the first time in 2 years, Churchill felt the crushing weight of isolation lift from his shoulders. Within weeks, he crossed the Atlantic on the battleship HMS Duke of York, braving U-boat-infested waters to meet President Franklin D. Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. The two men, so different in temperament yet bound by shared purpose, formed an alliance that would reshape the world. Churchill was awed by America's capacity for production and by Roosevelt's easy confidence. Their late-night meetings were filled with cigars, jokes, and whiskey, but beneath the camaraderie lay a grim resolve. Both leaders understood that the road to victory would be long and terrible. Back in Britain, Churchill's speeches took on a new tone. No longer defiant isolation, but fierce partnership. "Now we are in the same boat," he told Parliament, "and it is a mighty boat." The factories of Detroit began sending tanks, planes, and food across the Atlantic. Britain, though battered, was no longer alone. It was a turning point, not only in the war, but in Churchill's journey as a leader. For the first time, he could see the faint glimmer of victory on the horizon. By 1944, Churchill's war map was covered in red pins, each marking a front, a battle, a hope. The Allies were preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy. Churchill was restless. He longed to be there in person, to witness the liberation of Europe. He had to be physically restrained by his generals from joining the invasion fleet. They reminded him, "If you are killed, Prime Minister, the war could be lost." He reluctantly stayed behind, pacing, smoking, waiting. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as the first reports came in, Churchill sat in his underground office, his eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. Then came the message he'd waited years to hear. "The landings have begun." That evening, he addressed Parliament, his voice heavy with emotion but steady as ever. "This vast operation is undoubtedly the most complicated and difficult that has ever taken place," he said. "We shall not know for many days how well it has succeeded, but success will surely crown our enterprise." As Allied troops fought their way across France, Churchill visited the beaches weeks later. He walked among the wreckage, tanks half buried in sand, helmets scattered in dunes, and felt the immensity of the sacrifice. But he also felt vindication. This was the beginning of Germany's end. Every mile gained in Normandy brought the war closer to the day he had envisioned since 1940, the day when the lights of Europe would shine freely once more. In May 1945, after 6 long years, Churchill stood at a window in the Ministry of Health overlooking Whitehall. Below, thousands of Londoners cheered and waved flags. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. He leaned on his cane, the cigar unlit in his hand, and whispered, "This is your victory." When he stepped out to speak to the crowd, they roared his name. "No," he said, "it belongs to the people." It was the moment he had lived for, but also the moment that would end his power. The war had made him indispensable. Peace would make him expendable. Within months, his party lost the general election. As the ballots were counted, Churchill accepted defeat without bitterness. "They have a right to want the fruits of victory," he told his wife Clementine, but history had already claimed him. He would forever be remembered as the man who, when darkness fell on Europe, refused to bow. The man whose voice steadied a frightened island, whose words became a weapon, whose courage gave others courage. Winston Churchill was not flawless. He was stubborn, impulsive, and often infuriating, but he was the leader Britain needed when all seemed lost. And in those darkest hours, he did not simply lead his nation. He taught the world that defiance can be as powerful as victory.